Hey
Yay!
everyone, welcome to Empower Debate. We hope everyone is good today, and we are super excited to get started off on our critiques workshop today. Here's just like a little message here. Make sure to follow our social media and join our Discord.
Yay! Okay, hi guys. I'm Caitlin Tapia. I'm from Capel, and I've been doing LD for quite a bit, some time, and I'm gonna be giving the critique lecture with Grady. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Grady. I go to Colleyville Heritage. I've been doing LD for about a year. I did PF before that. Pretty much exclusively a K debater.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We have some people who are entering the waiting room. Steven, do you want me to just admit them as we go, or do you want to handle that?
I could handle that.
Okay, cool, perfect. So let's start off with a brief introduction because overall this lecture is going to be pretty introductory, but let's go over briefly what exactly is a critique and what does it mean to read one. Okay, a critique, first and foremost, is a departure from a traditional style of debate in which the affirmative has the burden of proof, which means that they have to prove a net beneficial solvency from the status quo, and the negative has the burden of rejoinder, which means that they have to prove that there is a net harm to the affirmative's plan. A traditional model of debate typically uses something called fiat. And fiat is something that I think a lot of debaters tend to misunderstand at the beginning, but an easy way to conceptualize it is just a tool to imagine the hypothetical passage of the plan that you're advocating for, whether that be the plan in your 1AC, a counter plan, or even an alternative to a critique in some instances. So fiat is not real, but it is something that is enacted within an imaginary debate world, which again is hypothetical. And the purpose of fiat is to compare different worlds and to evaluate the opportunity cost to doing something, right? So if you want to determine whether or not an advocacy is going to be net beneficial, fiat could be a useful tool to help determine what would happen as a consequence, and then you would evaluate the positive consequences versus the negative consequences. And I'm sure that most, if not all of you, are very familiar with the comparative worlds paradigm. So critiques, on the other hand, break away from these traditions and norms because they operate at a pre-fiat level more often than not. And pre-fiat, as the name would suggest, is not necessarily engaging in that hypothetical world, but rather tends to challenge phenomenon that is occurring in the real world. So things like assumptions, narratives, and representations within the debate space, particularly in the 1AC if you're reading a critique on the neg. Ks also tend to discuss issues regarding social justice and structural violence with concern to a specific marginalized group or experience at the level of content. So let's go through the different parts of a critique. Grady, do you want to go over this?
Yeah, so there are five main parts of the K, and this will kind of be an introductory slide, and then we'll go in depth on all of these in the coming slides. The first part is a thesis or the theory of power, which is essentially just your explanation of how violence happens in the world and why it happens. Then there is the link, which could be based on assumptions, narratives, representations, or consequences. And it is basically just saying that the affirmative engages in the form of violence that the theory of power describes. Then you have the impact, which functions the same as something like a disadvantage or the affirmative impacts, in that it just says why the critique actually matters to the judge, and i.e., what are the effects of the links or the theory of power. Then there's the alternative, which is what method or strategy the negative proposes in order to resolve or overcome the links, i.e., what they can do to materially solve for violence or what they can do in order to kind of change the debate space. Then there's the role of the ballot. So this differs from the comparative worlds paradigm, in which in a comparative worlds paradigm, you are evaluating what a world looks like in which we pass the plan versus the status quo or a competitive counterplane, for example. However, a role of the ballot for critique would essentially say how the judge evaluates different impacts, but we'll go more into it in a little bit.
Sorry, I was trying to mute my mic there. Okay, let's talk about the thesis or theory of power. And this is the starting point to your critique in terms of where it is situated within your shell. Typically, it is present at the very, very top, the first card that you would read on a K. The theory of power, like Grady said, explains the root cause, and it is an explanation for why the majority of forms of violence happens in the world. Now, depending on your theory of power, you may want to say that it is the root cause to literally every single form of suffering that we experience, or maybe it is just a tool to help explain why certain forms of violence happens, right? So it can be either based in some sort of libidinal or psychological claim, which means that it is innate, it is something that we are kind of primarily conditioned to believe or abide by, or it can be embedded in structures, right? It can be something that is enforced by the government or by other social structures and relations, etc. And so this is a very broad, overarching term. We'll go into different examples of what theory of powers look like, but in order to understand how they operate, we should look to the root cause, right? And so a root cause argument says that this is the explanation for why XYZ other things occur in the world, right? So this can be material. So if you look to wars, impacts like wars, right? Different war scenarios that debaters typically read on the affirmative, you can claim that there is a root cause that kind of explains why those forms of material violence happen. Like, for example, due to the settler colonialism theory of power, there can be increased territorialization, the desire to grab land and encroach on the territory of others. And that is an explanation for how the root cause causes the material violence that the affirmative seeks to prevent, as well as climate change, right? Like a K would say theory of power is capital accumulation, which leads to material impacts like infinite accumulation, disregard for certain knowledge systems, etc. It can also lead to more interpersonal forms of violence like hate crimes and exclusion. It doesn't necessarily have to be this big extinction claim, because remember, with the critique, you are kind of given more flexibility in terms of what you can claim as an impact at the level of content, and you're not so much restricted to reading these huge extinction scenarios that you see in a lot of 1ACs and traditional disads or counterplans. Okay, I can also go over the links. So there are three main categories of links for a critique. The first is assumptions, and assumptions can be conceptualized as a kind of presupposition that the 1AC has about the world. And I know that sounds a little bit tautological, but I guess you can think of it as like the affirmative has assumed that some sort of institution or method or approach to something is inherently good or bad, and that we should accept it on face, right? So fiating through the USFG, for example, that assumes that the United States is a valid actor within the world, and a critique would seek to challenge or dismantle that assumption, right? Next is representations, which are a little bit different, right? It's not necessarily like an assumption per se, but it is more so how a certain argument has been phrased or represented, or the way in which the discourse of the 1AC was deployed. And these can have impacts such as stereotyping certain groups or constructing a broader overall narrative. Can have negative consequences other than just the material effects that the affirmative seeks to produce or to prevent. Last is consequences. So critiques can actually link off of consequences as well. It is not necessarily entirely pre-fiat, but the negative can say that the plan will cause material harm in the world of the affirmative, which is fiated, right? That's in the hypothetical world. And that causes harm to a specific group of people, or it feeds into a theory of power that the critique has outlined, which reproduces a form of violence that is at the root cause of the affirmative's impacts, right? And so the consequences link looks pretty different from the assumptions and representations, but either way, you kind of want to understand that a critique is challenging the underlying notions of the affirmative and not necessarily looking straight at the obvious outcomes of the plan. Grady, do you want to do impact and roll the ballot?
Yeah. So first, there is a delineation between the impact to a theory of power versus the impact of a link. And it's important that you understand that whenever you're actually giving something like a 2NR on the K. So an impact to a theory of power, if we take the example of something like Cap K, would say that capitalism causes extinction via infinite accumulation, which then results in climate change. Or it could be that capitalism causes war due to competition between countries. That is the impact to the theory of power itself, i.e. the theory of power that capitalism or the root cause of capitalism is accumulation. Then there is a difference between the impact of a link whenever you're reading cap K, which is that the cap K might say that unclose itself causes people to over extract things like the deep seabed, which is an impact to the link that you can leverage in the negative rebuttal when saying this link independently turns the affirmative because it means that they can't solve for climate change as they cause more emissions. Then the role of the ballot essentially says, how does the judge determine who is the better debater? Now, this can do a few different things. It can talk about materially, how do we weigh impacts? Psychologically, how do we weigh impacts? Or epistemologically, how do we weigh impacts? Which is just how do we, or kind of the modes of knowledge production that are produced. The role of the ballot basically is just how the judge should evaluate impacts in relation to the critique that you have read, which means that it needs to have some semblance to something like your theory of power, i.e., it could be that the role of the ballot is to dismantle decolonization because the theory of power says that colonization.
I've heard like 2 lines that relates to us.
Then the other thing is that one of the impacts of the K that you should be saying in the 2 and R is that it turned the AF through a few different areas. One of those would be kind of what I explained above about how if you're reading a cap K, it could turn a unclosed AF due to things like deep sea mining. But further, one thing that K debaters do is they say that because the K says that this is the form of violence or racism, then that gets internalized into the plan because we've won links to the affirmative representations, which means that the education that they kind of get surrounding the plan is always going to internalize racism, which then leads to serial policy failure, which is essentially that any education produced by the affirmative in terms of the policies that they create whenever debaters go outside of debate is always going to be or have a result of racism.
Okay, so I can cover subjectivity formation. This is a very, very broad kind of concept in debate, and different people have kind of different, I guess, notions and opinions on what exactly a subjectivity is. But I think that the best way to understand it in the context of debate specifically and how debaters and K debaters tend to use the term is that subject formation is the ways in which your opinions, your perceptions, and your thoughts and beliefs, which includes your relationalities, which is how you relate to other people and how you see yourself and your own social location within the world, how all of these things are shaped by debate and our speech acts and the practice of in-depth research over a long period of time, as well as involvement within the debate community. These are all activities that presumably shape our subjectivities, right? The affirmative, if they are not reading K, are going to say that debate does not have an influence on our subjectivities, or if it does, it is extremely minimal and should be disregarded, whereas the negative is going to say that debate is extremely impactful on our subjectivities, which means that we need to pay attention to the things that we say and hear because they can have long-term consequences if we carry it into our lives through our mentalities and through the skills and the education that we generate at the level of both content and form, because when we repeat things over time in many different debate rounds, it can, again, have an effect on our overall subjectivity, which is our thoughts, beliefs, opinions, perceptions, which are all reasons why our representations and the narratives that we construct with those representations and assumption matter in the real world and are translated from what we argue in a debate speech into the real world. Oh wait, one thing I forgot to add is that this can be an internal link to some of the impacts of the critique. So earlier we talked about things like hate crime and exclusion as a potential impact to a K. So if the affirmative has some sort of problematic rhetoric in the 1AC, then you can call them out for that and say, not only will it fuel our theory of power and lead to the impacts that you seek to avoid, but it could also lead to external impacts such as harming our subjectivities and our ability to conduct ethical forms of policy making, etc., which shapes the way that we view ourselves in relation to other people. Okay, Grady, do you want to cover the alternatives?
You can do alts.
Okay, cool. So let's go over the 2 different types of alternatives. I've split this up into 2 categories, epistemological and material. Let's go over material first, right? So material alts, you can conceptualize these as basically counter plans, right? And if y'all aren't familiar with counter plans, it's basically a counter advocacy to the AF that requires fiat, right? And so you're proposing an alternative world and you're saying here's a better option than the AF, and we should pretend that this option is passed, and we should also pretend that the AF is passed, and then see whose comparative world is better, right? Which one has the net beneficial consequences. And so to be clear, alternatives can be material and they can still use fiat. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be pre-fiated. The actor would be either a group or an institution, and so it'd likely be the United States federal government, or it would be some sort of revolutionary movement or organization. For example, the Zapatista theoretical revolution or some form of decolonial action. These would be examples of material alternatives that can be fiated. These tend to be more large scale and focus on changing the overall power of structure that you have outlined as problematic within the critique. It focuses on systemic material forms of violence, which are deeply ingrained within the government, within our social practices, and etc. And it competes off of the links, and this is going to be true of both types of alternatives. So now I want to shift over to the epistemological alternatives. This is different because it is pre-fiated. So you're not fiating the epistemological alternative. You are just saying that this would be an alternative orientation to the affirmative that is preferable because maybe it's more ethical, maybe it helps you see the world in a better way, maybe it helps you engage in a better research practice, or helps you understand a certain structure of power better, etc. Now, all of these sound a lot more small scale, right, in the grand scheme of things than the material alts. But K debaters would argue that epistemological alts are just as important because our ideologies are the reason why we decide to engage in corporal or larger scale movements, such as decolonization, right? And to be clear, the actor would be a specific debater or a judge. It can be the debate community writ large, but you wouldn't say this organization or this institution should do XYZ. That would be a material alternative, whereas epistemological would be we need to think of the world in this way, or we need to engage in this type of collective study. And as you can see, the type of language I'm using has a very strong emphasis and focus on knowledge and language, right? Which are, again, important parts of debate. And I want to draw attention to the fact that epistemological alternatives tend to rely more on subjectivity formations, which I discussed earlier. Although it also competes off of links, again, you want to have a very strong internal link as to how your alternative will help to resolve the ideologies that you've outlined in the affirmative as causing your impacts.
Alternatives can also function as a PIK, or in this case, a PIK, which is just a plan inclusive critique, which is essentially saying that we can do the entirety of the plan in the affirmative, except absent the links that the 1 and C says are harmful. So, for example, if the critique says that the affirmative's death impacts are harmful, a plan inclusive counterplan based around that would say that we can do the entirety of the affirmative absent their impacts because we've said that those are harmful, but maybe we can agree with the rest of the affirmative. And there's also something that is called a floating pick, which is essentially whenever it is not stated as a pick in the 1 and C, but rather kind of becomes one in the 2 and R. You do have to be careful about this because there is certain theory shells surrounding it, as it can be abusive if it is not actively labeled as a pick in the 1 and C.
Yeah, and so you can think of picks like, again, a counterplan where you're saying we can still fiat that the app happens, that we join UNCLOS, that we join the ICC, or if you're a policy debater, that the US strengthens intellectual property rights. But you would say still vote negative because we have outlined one part of the app that we pick out of. And typically picks are used as a framing device and not actually an advocacy, right? So it would basically argue that we can still agree with the majority of the AF, but if we have outlined a reason why the AF has presented an assumption, a form of rhetoric, or has helped to construct a narrative that is bad for the world, then you should still vote negative, even if you think that the overall outcome of the AF might be good, because it is a question of intention versus outcome, right? Okay, so now we can go over some of the examples here. Grady, while I go over the first example, do you want to answer any of the questions that are coming into the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's go over the capitalism K, right? This is your basic cookie cutter starting K that most people typically learn first. I personally did not learn the capitalism K first, but whatever. It is very basic and relatively easy to understand. There's a lot of literature surrounding it, and there's a lot of depth and nuance and different variants to the cap K. But let's just go over the very, very basic bare bone cap K. So one, let's go over the theory of power. It says that capitalism is the root cause of all violence, right? So like we talked about, this means that the majority of forms of violence that we see in the world are all predicated off of capitalist accumulation and the desire for commodity, flows in exchange of goods, and sale, profit, etc. Right? So slavery, for example, was based off the fungibilization or the commodification of the slave, as well as indigenous genocide, which led to the territorialization and taking over native lands for the aim of things like building factories on that land or accumulating more resources, right? Extraction from that land. It also leads to inequality, right? This one's pretty straightforward because the wealthy class versus the middle class versus the lower class, these are all divisions that create systemic economic and social inequality within the United States that is rooted in a capitalist logic of division. There's also poverty and class relations, etc., which I kind of brushed up on earlier. And these are all examples of large-scale impacts that are constructed by this infinite, never-ending drive to accumulate capital, right? And so notice how I framed this theory of power as more of an ideology, right? It is not a single technology, it's not a single policy that the government passed that led to all of these things, but rather it is our underlying drive and our desire to be capitalist within this world that causes XYZ forms of violence, right? Second, let's go over the link. The AF assumes that the acquisition of labor and resources from the ocean is good. So this is specific to the UNCLOS and ICC topic in LD. I guess presumably if the affirmative is reading an UNCLOS AF and says that we should engage in deep sea mining, for example, the negative could read a link off of the assumption that the AF thinks that it is okay to kind of take over the ocean as a territory and deem it as property of the United States and then continue to extract resources there, because that is the exact same assumption that justified capitalist accumulation, upon the colonization of the Americas and throughout the transatlantic slave trade, etc. Third is the impact, right? These were kind of explained above at the level of theory of power, but again, like Grady said, there's a difference between the impacts to the theory of power and the impacts to the link, right? The impacts to the link here are racialized violence, right? So you can say that capitalism leads to a racialization of certain people because of the division of people on the basis of their identities. It could also lead to resource wars if countries fight over limited resources, right? Because capitalism would say that at the level of theory of power, all resources are finite. There's not going to be an infinite number of resources, which means that it's inevitably unstable and unsustainable. It's going to collapse at a certain point. Capitalism can also lead to environmental degradation. It can lead to, obviously, pollution as a result of factories. Extraction would be decimating natural environments and biodiversity, etc. There are tons of warrants as to why capitalism is bad for the earth and for countries and governments and individual people writ large. Fourth is the alternative, which can be communism or socialism or some type of other organization. If we want to focus on communism and socialism, it would be some sort of party organizing with a specific mode of governance that whatever K debater can, I guess, choose on their own accords. And then fifth is the role of the ballot. The judge should vote for the best party organization. This is obviously a role of the ballot that would be best fitting for the K if the alternative is some form of party organization. And so it tends to be a little bit self-serving, but the point of the role of the ballot is for the judge to kind of frame out who should get the ballot, right? And you can think of it like a framework within a traditional debate, and it's kind of asking how does the judge determine who wins the debate? Is it just whoever presents the better critique? Is it whoever is best for XYZ people? In this case, the negative has said that the judge should vote for the team who has the best actual strategy to challenge capitalism through party organization. And so that gives the judge a little bit more of a clearer frame as to how they're going to be voting. So if the AF in this debate round fails to kind of present a reason why the plan would effectively challenge capitalism, then the AF shouldn't win the debate, right? Okay, Grady, do you want to go over set call?
Yeah, for sure. And then if you just answer any questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Settler colonialism is the idea that whenever settlers first came to the United States and they began to occupy that land, that started the root cause of all forms of violence. Settler colonialism says that things such as stealing land, the occupation of that land, creation of things like the settler nation state, labor exploitation through things such as the transatlantic slave trade, in which Black and Indigenous people were forced into slavery, and the kind of way that settlers tried to improve upon land by doing things like over extracting on that land via things like fossil fuels, then causes the climate crisis. settler colonialism basically essentially is just saying that whenever settlers came to the Americas and whenever they inhabited that land permanently, they securitize against Black and Indigenous people, which causes violence. Then the link. This is an example specifically to the UNCLOS side of the topic. It says that joining UNCLOS assumes that the United States should have control over ocean territories for the purpose of extraction, i.e., UNCLOS does things like prohibit deep sea mining, which is an example you've heard throughout the lecture. The argument is that the idea that UNCLOS can kind of determine how nation states can map out territories of things such as land in the oceans is inherently settler colonial, because whenever it says that countries EEZs or an extension of their land rights means that they can extract certain parts of the ocean that might be on indigenous lands, means that they can sort of eradicate those indigenous peoples, which is in their water, and efface their relationship to it. The impact would be something like genocide, state violence, or climate change. To go over them a little more in depth, basically, settler colonialism causes genocide because anytime that you are inhabiting indigenous land, settlers require the elimination of indigenous people and the attempt to better their land in order to do things such as make money, extract capital, etc. We can think of things such as reservations in the Trail of Tears. Whenever indigenous peoples were forced across the country and away and effaced from their land in order for settlers to improve it, and along the way, things such as genocide happened, which now permeates everyday life. The second is things like state violence, examples such as Cop City, which is essentially a small city where cops can simulate how they would interact with civilians and do things like practice different procedures, which is currently being built in, if I remember correctly, it's Detroit, which is on indigenous land. This is an example of state violence, or things such as the No Dapple pipeline being built, which was essentially whenever an oil company wanted to build a pipeline across an indigenous reservation that would, of course, not only be on indigenous lands, but also that oil from the pipeline would then infect indigenous waters, which provided the water in things like irrigation for thousands of indigenous people. Those are both examples of state violence that is caused from the kind of habitation of indigenous land. Then climate change. The argument is that whenever settlers have to improve upon land or strive to gain the most amount of capital possible, that causes overaccumulation, which leads to climate change. The alternative is typically decolonization. It can happen through a few different forms, but authors like Tuck and Yang argue that decolonization is a few things. It's the destruction of the imperial metropole and abolition of all contemporary forms of slavery, as well as the total repatriation of indigenous land. If you want more on that, you should probably read Tuck and Yang. But decolonization is essentially just giving land back to indigenous peoples. The role of the ballot, an example of one would be that the judge should situate their ballot in the post-colonial world / reshape settler subjectivities. Essentially, if we win a link that the affirmative is colonial, then the judge should reject that in favor of, or whenever they reject the affirmative, that causes the affirmative to have to confront that the one you see is colonial, which then shapes their subjectivities whenever they realize they have defended something that is colonial and can kind of work towards better education or shift subjectivities, which is what Caitlin was talking about earlier.
Sorry, it's so hard to figure out how to unmute my mic. Okay, so the third example that we're going to be going over is the anti-Blackness critique. So first, let's go over the theory of power. It says that anti-Blackness is the root cause of all violence, and typically debaters say that violence originated in the transatlantic slave trade, which led to impacts that we see to this day, such as inequality against Black Americans, as well as otherization, so the creation of in-groups versus out-groups, and determining who belongs in things like humanity, civil society, etc., bracketing out and excluding certain populations, as well as the impacts of capitalism as a result of the slave trade, right? So again, we kind of touched up on this on capitalism. A lot of these critiques share similar themes and similar kind of mentions at the level of content, but they operate a little bit differently in terms of the groups that they are focusing on, and as well as the historical vectors that they tend to base for their conclusions. Second, the link is typically, something a little bit more broad for anti-Blackness case, just in terms of what I've tended to notice in Lincoln Douglas debate, right? So any of the links that worked for Sekal or the cap K could technically also work for the anti-blackness K, but for this specific shell, we use the example of the AF assuming that the state is a good institution that can create forms of progress and liberation, or it engages in some form of criminalization, right? And so the theory of power would say that the criminalization of Black folk in the United States is very much prevalent. We can see this in the prison industrial complex as well as the military industrial complex with the war on terror, the war on drugs, etc. And these are all, again, phenomena that can explain why the logic of criminalization is so heavy within the United States. And it challenges and seeks to dismantle and disrupt the notion that the United States federal government can be a good heuristic that can create some sort of liberation or freedom when this does not seem possible in light of all criminalizing logics. And then third, the alternative can be a number of different things. Most commonly, it tends to be like a rejection or a refusal of some sort. And more pessimistic critiques would say that we must burn down the world and our conception of what the world is right now in order to imagine new futurities, or maybe not at all. Again, this is all very specific to the variant of the anti-blackness K that you are reading. There are more optimistic ones, and then there are more pessimistic ones, and then there are ones in the middle. There are ones that are more intersectional and focus on, for example, Black queerness. But with every critique comes different alternatives, different links, and different role of the ballots. But this is just one example, right? So there can very well be an anti-blackness K that just says, you know, anti-blackness originated from the slave trade. The affirmative assumes that the state is a good institution when this is not possible for certain groups of people. The alternative is to burn down the world, which is something that cannot be conceptualized by non-Black people. And Wilderson says that this is a kind of methodology that is only intelligible and able to be enacted by Black individuals. And then finally, the role of the ballot would be that the judge should decenter or deconstruct whiteness. And again, there can be different role of the ballots, but this is one of the phrasings that I've seen on the circuit. It says that basically the judge should, again, attempt to kind of alter subjectivities, but at the same time, it says that the judge has an ethical obligation to reject instances of anti-Blackness on the basis of ethicality. Okay. Grady, was there anything else you wanted to add to the examples?
Not that I can think of now.
Okay, I think this might be a good place to pause for questions. So if anybody wants to unmute, then go on ahead, because we have covered quite a bit at this point, and I don't want anybody to get lost before we get into like the affirmative and how to answer the K. Okay, wait. I'm just gonna answer what's in chat really quick. Why doesn't the Academy K link to pre-fiat net Ks? It does, but I have never seen a 1AR read an Academy K. I think it would be a little bit too late breaking. Like the Academy K requires a lot of evidence and a lot of warranting. It would be a 1NC argument against a critical affirmative. But I think that the issue is that the 1AR doesn't really have enough time to read a whole K. Maybe they could read it as like a short little one-carded indite to the presentation of a K in the debate space, but that would look a little bit different. I thought the link was attempting to circulate new forms of discoursing the academy, not endorsing the state. That can very well be a link to the anti-blackness K. But that's more of, like you said, a lens to like the academy K, as opposed to just like settler colonialism, and anti-blackness more broadly. But yeah, like I said, like these are not the only possible links to these Ks. There can be like as many links as you can envision, right? It can be any instance where the app has presented like a problematic form of rhetoric or discourse or narratives. And so this is just one example of what a link could look like within each of these shells, but there are a lot of different possibilities. Does anybody else have any questions about the examples or like the different parts of a critique? Can there be an unlimited amount of Ks? We'll
There,
talk about it.
oh, sorry.
No, you're good. You can go ahead.
There is not necessarily an unlimited amount of Ks, even if there are a lot of different links that you can generate, because all critiques are going to kind of be based in the same theorizations. So if you understand something like cap and anti-blackness, then you can get into more nuanced Ks like Moten and Harney's theorization of logistics, which is just to say that all critiques are sort of interlinked in their theorizations, which means that there isn't necessarily an infinite number of them because you can always attack it the same way that you would with Ks that intersect with their theories of power.
Yeah, I think that was a very, very good answer. And I don't really have much to add. We'll talk about this a little bit more, I believe, on the framework page whenever we're going on to answering the Ks, because as you'd imagine, a lot of AFs will argue that, oh, Ks are explosive and infinite, and there can be as many tiny critiques as you want. But in reality, I think in terms of debatability and the ability to categorize these critiques, I don't think that there are an infinite number of Ks because there's capitalism, anti-blackness, academy, like pessimism, set call, obviously, anti-queerness. I can only name maybe up to 20 off the top of my head. That's still a pretty big number. But there are also quite a lot of plan apps. There are a lot of advantages. So it's not necessarily specific to critiques. But that's just my opinion. Okay, I guess if nobody else has questions as of now, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if y'all have questions, we can go over them at that point, but let's go over answering Ks. Grady, do you want to cover framework?
You do framework, then I'll do the stuff after framework.
Okay, sounds good. So framework, this is probably one of the most important arguments against the critique that you're going to have to pay attention to. And it took me the longest to understand this section because everything else seemed a little bit more straightforward to me. But framework, for the longest time, for quite a few years, I just couldn't really understand how to do the line by line in a way that was cohesive and telling a good story overall. I didn't really understand the justification behind why reading Ks was beneficial for debate, which seems ironic because I would read a critique every single round and then not understand the basis for why it is important that Ks exist in debate. And that should probably give you a hint into what type of argument framework is trying to present. So framework basically questions whether or not Ks should even be in debate at all. It is similar to a theory argument in the sense that it would say that impacts like fairness, education, clash, and engagement matter more than the impacts of the critique, and that they come first. They are a procedural question of the debate. If y'all aren't familiar with theory at all, that's completely fine, but just understand framework as an argument that says that Ks should not be in debate because they are unfair and uneducational, right? And there's nuance within framework too, as well as all of the other arguments that we've talked about, right? There's not necessarily just one framework interpretation or one way to answer critiques with framework, but typically it goes along the lines of, challenging the critique being in the debate space at all, which is not content specific, right? So it's very different from actually answering their theory of power and saying, no, capitalism is not the root cause of all violence, or the AV is anti-settler colonialist. You are not engaging at the level of content. You are just saying at pure level of form, the critique should not exist in debate, all right? The apps will say that the plan does something materially good, such as solving extinction, which outweighs everything else. The negative will respond to such a claim with saying that fiat is illusory, which means that fiat is hypothetical, it is not real. When the judge votes for the affirmative, the plan will not actually pass, right? Like when the judge clicks their ballot on tab room, it's not actually going to make the United States join UNCLOS, right? That would be silly. And so the neg says that only representations matter, okay? And these are two competing claims, obviously, right? The AF is going to respond with framework and they're going to say, no, but it's still valuable to evaluate, the consequences of the plan and determine whether or not it's a good idea for blah, blah, blah reasons, right? And so framework is that kind of debate, right? It is largely a question of fiat and whether or not the AF gets access to their consequences of the plan. And it is a question of whether or not the neg can exclude the AF's consequences in this manner. Okay, let's go over the potential interpretations. And so with any theory shell, right, the first thing that comes is the interpretation, which is your kind of rule or standard for what debate ought to look like. So I have 4 examples here. First is that the affirmative is a research project, right? This one is a little bit more broad and general, and it can have different subjective interpretations within that, right? But generally speaking, if the affirmative is a research project, that means that the work that the AF did to put into their research project, right, the 1AC, should matter. And this is premised off the notion that the AF had infinite prep to cut their 1AC. From the start of the topic release up until whatever tournament you're debating at, they had all of that time to research the literature of the affirmative and determine what cards they want to cut and to read the articles from which they got their cards. And so this all means that the AF has put a specific amount of time and effort into creating the 1AC as a research project. And that would mean that the role of the negative is to prove that the AF's research project is flawed, right? And that means that the underlying assumptions going into the affirmative matter as well, and not just, things like extinction or nuclear war that happen as a result of the hypothetical passage of the plan. The second interp is that the affirmative must justify their representations prior to being able to weigh their plan. This is the interpretation that I personally read most often. Some people don't like it, but it seems to have worked for me just fine. It basically just means that the AF has to justify the links or explain why it is valuable to evaluate the affirmative before they get to weigh the plan, right? And so it's pretty similar to saying the affirmative is a research project, but it is saying that they do get to weigh their consequences, but only after they prove that their research project is good, right? And so it is a little bit different there. It seeks to, strategically cushion a little bit of the affirmative's offense there on framework. The third interpretation, this is where we get into the interps that the affirmative would probably read on framework. Weigh the hypothetical consequences of the plan against a competitive alternative. Now, I've personally heard these words like a million times. I have probably dreamt of them in my sleep. They're just kind of something that every single 1AR against the K says over and over again. Quite simply put, it just means that the affirmative should get to weigh like the post-fiated consequences of the plan versus like a material alt, right? So remember back here, I'm actually going to go back here. We went over the different types of alternatives. It can be either material or epistemological. And this framework basically says that negative alts have to be material, right? It cannot just be a mindset shift. It cannot just be a change in our research practices or challenging something, rejecting, refusing something. None of that. It has to be something that is fiated, right? And so under this interpretation, the AF wants to have a plan versus counterplan debate. They want the negative to basically read a counterplan. And then finally, there's only evaluate the hypothetical consequences of the plan. And this is the most extreme kind of interpretation because it basically means that critiques shouldn't exist in debate at all, or at least like pre-fiat critique should not exist in debate at all, because it says that you can only look to whether or not in the fiated world, in this imaginary debate world, whether or not the AF is net good or bad. So again, the bottom two framework interpretations kind of mean that the AF wants to have like a plan versus disad or a plan versus counterplan debate, whereas the first two interpretations would be read by the negative because they say that it's important to present criticisms of your research project or your representations before you get to weigh the plan. Okay. Wow, lots of framework stuff. Okay, Grady. Do you want to perchance take framework AF?
Yeah, I can do that. Okay, so these are the justifications for why we should only focus on the hypothetical consequences of the affirmative. The first is that a critique or the K's framing interpretation would moot the entirety of the 1AC, i.e., if they want to link to one sentence that is in the AF, the other 5 minutes and 50 seconds of the AF that I read, I can no longer weigh or leverage in the debate round, which is unfair because all of the pre-round prep that I put into the affirmative and the fact that the 1AC is my only piece of offense in the round is now mooted, which is extremely unfair to the affirmative, which is the justification and kind of the internal link into fairness. The second is that it explodes neg limits to infinite, and that they can generate infinite unpredictable links. This is also something that someone brought up in the chat earlier, which is that Ks can oftentimes have a plethora of links that can be to singular words that are in the affirmative or just core assumptions. And the argument is that even if I was interested in researching something like settler colonialism, I cannot prep out all of those links before the round, which means that they are unpredictable because I cannot predict what they're going to say about this one word that is in an unhighlighted or some portion of my card, which means that I cannot engage in the K in the first place, and also that it's unfair for them to be able to moot the entirety of the 1AC with the link that I couldn't even predict and engage with. then is that this is kind of what I was explaining earlier about how it holds us accountable for every word or author that is in the 1AC, because they can just choose one word or a sentence or an author that they think is bad and critique that, which moves to 1AC. Then is that a kind of a justification for why our model would be better is that it precludes clash and engagement using the plan and education surrounding it would foster advocacy or policymaking skills. There are tons of evidence that people read that says that plan focus and weighing comparative worlds against each other produces the best education, because it means that people, whenever they go outside of debate, are sort of able to know how the state operates and also are able to know how to put in legislation. And if they result in being legislation makers or policymakers of some sort, then it is important for them to know how things such as international relations or inequality operate and how we can solve that through legislation. However, a critique would say that we should not focus on the plan versus another piece of legislation, but rather should just debate about out-of-state education strategies, because decolonization is not forwarded through a policy, but a group of people, which means that we never get the education surrounding the plan text that we say is good. Therefore, even if the plan doesn't actually get passed as a result of the judge voting AF, which is kind of an answer to the entire fiat is illusory thing, even if the plan doesn't literally get passed when the judge votes AF, the education that we get is still important. And there's also other justifications for education, like it's the reason why schools fund debate, and it's the reason why a lot of parents put their kids in debate, etc.
Okay, cool. So I can go over the negative, right? And this would be kind of the way to respond to everything that Grady just said. So the negative on the framework page would say that not being able to weigh your representations and assumptions and narratives would mean a few things. One is that it fails to hold racist argumentation accountable, right? So in a world where the AF can say whatever they want and they can outline any intent, any assumptions, as long as they prove that there is a net beneficial consequence to the affirmative, then they can still win the debate round, right? And not to get too political here, but I think an easy way to illustrate this notion is Donald Trump saying that immigrants eat dogs and cats, and then proceeding to use that as a justification for strengthening border policy, right? And so if a debater were to come up and say the same thing, and to say, you know, immigrants are these dirty alien criminals that are eating our dogs, they're eating our cats, and then they use that to justify stringent border policy and say, oh, that's going to decrease crime, that's going to save our economy, and that's going to save us from extinction. In a world of debate where the negative is not allowed to read a critique against that type of affirmative, that would totally greenlight 100% of what they said, so long as they can prove that they have an extinction impact, right? Because extinction is infinite, it has infinite magnitude, it's the most important thing in the world, and none of the stuff that they said that was racist and problematic matters because it's not a consequence, right? It doesn't lead to extinction, and so who cares? And so this is the type of model of the debate that presumably the affirmative, to a very far extreme, granted, could kind of justify, right? And this ties into the notion of subjectivity formation. So remember how we talked about earlier, debate can shape our subjectivities in the sense that it changes our knowledge and skills and our relationalities and our views of ourselves in relation to other people. And so if the affirmative has some sort of racist argumentation, or even in a more subtle way, right, some sort of assumption about a group of people that can apply a stereotype writ large, that is bad because it leads to serial policy failure, and it can cause bad relationalities, and it can affect our real world lives, which outweighs fairness and education in this one individual debate round. Because yes, fairness and education can be important, but at the end of the day, you know, these things should not be blindly maximized at the cost of ethics, right? And doing the right thing and achieving justice for marginalized groups of people. Next, it moves core neg ground. At this point, right, critiques have been read in debate for many decades, and this is something that most people in debate acknowledge, right? Even from very traditional schools that read predominantly plan arguments and policy affirmatives, they will still recognize that they need to prep out Ks, right? Big schools are still going to have blocks against the Ks. They're still going to, you know how to answer them. They're going to have a basic understanding of cap, anti-blackness, settler colonialism, etc., because they know that these are arguments that are prevalent at high-level debates, right? And maybe this looks different at traditional circuits and in UIL, at lay debate and in those types of tournaments. But in my experience, even as a debater in Texas who has gone to like local TFA tournaments, and I've also competed in UIL competitions very locally, even with like parent judges, I was aware of the existence of critiques and that I needed to prep them out. All of this is to say that critiques are core neg ground, right? In this day and age, Ks are an important part of negative strategy, more so in like the national circuit, but even in like smaller levels of a debate, or not smaller levels, I should say like more local levels of debate. And the third argument is that it arbitrarily reduces the AF to a plain text. Again, this is kind of trying to say that critiques are predictable and the affirmative should have been prepared to engage with them because there's no reason why we should only look to the consequences of the AF. There's literally no reason, right? It may seem intuitive to some of y'all, but it's not based in any sort of definition, and it's not based in something that the topic committee has given us or the tournament rules say. It is just something that we as a community for a very long time traditionally believed, that we can only weigh the extinction impacts of the plan. But debate has changed now, and some may say that is an ahistorical vision of what debate ought to look like. And finally, it allows extinction outweighs to uplayer and crowd out K engagement, which we kind of talked about earlier, right? And so you can tie in arguments as to how structural violence comes first and why that is a reason their model of debate is bad, because it forecloses the ability to have meaningful discussions about critiques. Therefore, even if the plan hypothetically results in something that can be materially good, it is all part of an imaginary debate world, right? The negative will, more often than not, rely on the notion that fiat is illusory, and they will say that we have to focus, therefore, on real-world implications of our rhetoric. Okay, I'm gonna skip the subjectivity formations page because we are running slightly low on time, and I do want to have, a good chunk of time for the Q&A, just to make sure that everybody is on the same page. But the subjectivity formations page, just a brief sum up, it is basically exactly what I said earlier. The AF will try to say that debate has a minimal effect on our subjectivities because alternative factors like friends, family, school, and religion are more influential, and the fact that there are competitive incentives, right? We're just in here because we want to win the ballot, right? Not really because we care about the issues that the critique presents, which means debate cannot shape our subjectivities. And the negative will have arguments to counter each of those warrants, but TLDR, the AF says debate doesn't shape our subjectivities. The negative says, yes, debate does shape our subjectivities. Okay, Grady, do you want to go over this part?
So now we'll be covering how to answer a critique's theory of power. The first thing that I'm not sure if this was actually above in other parts of the slideshow, but I think it's probably important to mention is that the affirmative is always pretty much going to have access to extinction outweighs unless the affirmative is reading a structural violence AF, which is to say that even if the affirmative is right, that maybe the effects of the plan or the representations of the plan are bad and might cause marginal violence, that pales in comparison to extinction that would kill infinite future generations and preclude their life in the first place. I'm not sure if that was answered above, but I think that it's typically put around the whenever you're answering the thesis part. Now, some attacks that are specific to the theory of power is that the theory of power is generalizing, totalizing, or homogenizing. One example is that the settler native binary, referring to settler colonialism, is totalizing because it excludes indigenous immigrants. This is just to say that the theory of power kind of groups people into one category in which that ignores how complex groups can be. Then it could say that the theory of power is outdated, incorrect, or not empirically proven. An example of this is that psychoanalysis is non-falsifiable. It has not been proven in clinical trials. It is not researched in things like laboratories or proper testing zones, which means that it is not scientifically proven. Or you could say that there are alt causes to the forms of violence that the negative explains. For example, capitalism is not the root cause of all violence since ideological influences exist, i.e. capitalism cannot explain why people are biased towards certain skin tones or why racism can happen, not in order to gain capital, but purely out of the fact that racism happens aside from being able to gain capital.
Okay, I can go over the answer to links. So there's three different types of responses to links. First, it's a link turn, which kind of flips the narrative of the link and says that the AF is actually good for the group of people that the K seeks to protect. It is a move towards the alternative, or that the affirmative does the opposite of what the link says. So this proves that even if the AF represents the state as good, for example, it also gives more material benefits to indigenous people through extraction. This is an interesting argument. So the second case says that extraction is bad for indigenous people, but the affirmative could argue that, extraction poses benefits for indigenous groups as well because it allows the state to have more resources and they have more money so that they can do things like welfare programs, which would help people in poverty. Indigenous and Hispanic populations are disproportionately in poverty in the United States, and so that could be a way to link turn that type of critique. You could also say that AF prevents extinction, which would hurt Black and Native populations. Yeah, that is an argument that exists in debate, and it is demonstrated with a link turn because it proves that the affirmative is a move towards trying to help the groups of people that the K seeks to protect. Next is link defense, and just like the name of the link, the name of the argument suggests, it is defensive, right? And so it's not actually generating any offense for the AF, but it's just kind of shielding them from what the link is saying by saying that the AF does not represent or assume XYZ. So the negative would say that, the AF assumes that the state is good because they use fiat, right? The AF can say, no, we don't assume that the state is good because we say that the state should join UNCLOS because we actually think that the state is not doing a great job right now. But a way to fix that is by joining UNCLOS, right? And so that's a no-link argument because they're saying that you were wrong about our assumption, right? We actually assumed otherwise. And then finally, there's the impact turn. Concede the links, they're good. Okay, I called this the impact turn because I wasn't exactly sure to call it a link turn because the link turn was done above. But anyhow, for example, you could say that like representing the state is a good thing and representing extraction is a good thing. And so like this is again kind of a link turn, but it's more specific to the impact of the link, right? Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So you don't really have to know exactly how to categorize these types of arguments, but just know that this is generally along the lines of the responses that the AF is going to make. Okay, in response to the alternative, the AF can say that the alt does not solve, right? This is called a solvency deficit, and it can say that it doesn't resolve the negatives links or it doesn't solve the affirmatives advantages. So for example, if the alt has the alt is material such as decolonization, the AF can say it doesn't solve for protection of international law or it doesn't actually solve for anti-indigenous violence, which says that it doesn't solve for the AF or it doesn't solve for the negs impacts. Then it can say that the alt resolves in an external negative impact, right? And this is, I guess, kind of like a turn, right? It's saying that the alternative would be net worse. So, for example, the affirmative can say decolonization leads to transition wars, right? When we're going from a system of governance where the USFG has control and sovereignty over North America, and then we're suddenly shifting to a new mode of governance where indigenous people have sovereignty, that could lead to wars and conflicts between different indigenous groups, between settlers and native people. And if like for example, American settlers do not want to go to another country, they could begin like violent insurrections and stuff like that. And that can lead to a lot more deaths and suffering than the status quo does. And so the AF could say that the alternative would be worse than the status quo, and it's a reason not to do it. Okay. Grady, do you want to go over the perms?
You do perms, I'll do theory.
Okay, cool. So the permutations, right? Just what are they? They are a test of competition. They're not an advocacy. That is important. You have to watch out for severance and intrinsicness because if you try to go for them as an advocacy, it can tend to run into issues with theory and lead to severance or intrinsicness. I'll explain what that is in a little bit, but a permutation is just kind of a test which says whether or not the alternative is truly competitive with the AF on a textual or a functional basis. And so just like a counterplan, an alternative needs to compete with the AF in some way, and the perm is questioning whether the alt truly does compete. So the first type is perm do both. Perm do both is like the most basic perm. You should always say it in the 1ER if you read a plan and you debate against a critique. It just says we can do both the plan and we can do the counterplan, right? So the US should join UNCLOS and they can do decolonization. And those things are not mutually exclusive. Next is a time frame or sequencing perm, which says that we do one and then the other. It can be the AF and then the alt, or it can be the alt and then the AF, right? So the US should join UNCLOS and then decolonize, or we should decolonize and then join UNCLOS. Now, this type of permutation might be problematic because it could engage in severance, right? Severance is when the affirmative kind of severs out of a portion of the plan text, and in this case, they would be severing out of the immediacy of the plan. And that could be bad. It could be a voter for like shiftiness, because that would justify the plan shifting and changing throughout the debate, which makes it a moving target and hard to engage with. That's just a theory argument. If you don't 100% understand what I'm talking about, that's totally fine. That's just an argument that the neg could make against the time frame perm. The next example is a double bind, right? Either the alternative overcomes a link or it fails to solve for the links. So this is saying that when the negative reads the K, either the reading of the K and the presentation of the alternative should have resolved the problematic rhetoric of the AF by calling attention to it and raising awareness, or it fails to solve and it doesn't actually do anything, which means that you shouldn't vote neg even if they have outlined something wrong about the AF's assumptions, because they cannot solve for it. Next is perm the AF through the lens of the alt, or through the mindset of the alternative, as some people say. And this says that, for example, if the alt says we need to deconstruct settler colonialist epistemologies or settler colonial subjectivities, the AF can say we should join UNCLOS while keeping that in mind, right? We should use that ideology and mindset while still materially enacting what the plan says that we should do. And finally, there's perm the AF and the non-competitive parts of the alt. And again, this is an example of severance pretty clearly because it severs out of, well, I mean, the non-competitive parts of the alt. The answer to most of these perms, other than perm do both when you're on the negative, is like, these are all severance or intrinsicness, which are voters for shiftiness, and the permutations all fail because we have a link, which proves that we compete, right? And so the permutations all come down more or less to whether or not the negative has a link to the AF. And if they have a link to the AF, then the perms are kind of cooked and none of them make much sense.
Cool. Now we'll go over theoretical objections to the critique or different parts of the critique. This is separate from framework, although some of the impacts are going to be the same as framework. So first is vague alts or actor specification. These are separate, but vague alts would say that if you just say decolonization, the affirmative cannot engage in that because they don't know what decolonization entails, i.e., how do we defend against decolonization as an alternative method if we don't know what specific actions are being taken towards decolonization? It's kind of just posited that this can solve the links. However, it's extremely vague, which means that we don't actually get education surrounding the critique or any of their scholarship because we can't engage with it in the first place. Then there's actor specification, which is just that failing to specify who does the alternative is a voting issue, because then again, the affirmative cannot engage with that because they do not know how the alternative, would be enacted or would kind of function in the real world. Then there's international fiat. This is, I think, most likely applies to like CAPKs, which is that if they say that we engage in dual party organizing in other countries rather than just the United States, and they fiat that is a voting issue because you cannot just imagine that we do this in other countries or that other countries work together. Kaylin, if you have something to add on that.
I think for now, no, but there might be questions that pop up about it, but yeah.
And then there's private actor fiat, which is also applies a lot to like the CAPK or other things, which is just saying that you cannot fiat that a individual actor or group of people does the method. You can then not fiat that because we should only be fiating that governments do things. Then there is condo. Condo is the idea that if you read a critique, you can kick the alternative and not go for it, which means that the affirmative cannot develop offense against it in the 2AR. The affirmative will say that, first of all, if you kick the critique, it kind of means that you were not that invested into the critique, even though the entire K is saying that the representations and the way that we go about debating things is super important. Then is that if alternatives in different advocacies are condo, the negative can read infinite advocacies in the 1 and C, or just a ton of advocacies in the 1 and C, and then kick all of them but one, which would then moot a lot of the work and kind of sandbag the 1AR on all of the work that they had to do on each of the individual advocacies. Dispositionality is kind of similar to that. Just ask us if you have questions on it. It is basically just saying that if the affirmative does X thing, then we can kick the critique or the advocacy, i.e. if the affirmative makes a permutation, you can kick it. The reason why that's the same or basically the same as condo is that every single 1AR is going to make a permutation. Then there is picks. That picks are bad because you can pick out of individual words of the affirmative, which kind of explained on framework. Then there is that floating picks are bad because if it is not labeled as a pick in the 1 and C, then we do not know that it is a pick. Therefore, we cannot engage, even though an alternative being an alternative versus a pick completely changes how it's debated, because the pick says we can do the entirety of the absent the links, but the alternative is a complete rejection of the affirmative in favor of something else, which means that negatives should probably specify in the 1 and C whether or not it is a floating pick.
Okay, cool. And I think that was actually our last slide. So now we're going to do question and answer. I'm actually going to start off by answering Cody's question from the chat. They asked, for the next topic, AGI is immoral. Could you create a K that says that the app assumes debaters or humans have the capacity to determine morality? Therefore, you can't vote app because humans can't determine morality. And if so, how would you structure a K? Okay, that's a great question. That actually seems like a very good idea. And the first thing that you would have to do in order to structure a critique like that is think of what your theory of power would be, right? So you have to explain why violence happens in the world. And I think that one of the most fitting ones for a critique along these lines would probably be biopolitics. Biopolitics says that we cannot kind of determine whether or not somebody has the right to live, and that the state employs certain tactics to dictate whether or not somebody is living to their full productive extent, or they're living for the purpose of serving the government or for serving society in the way that they deem appropriate. And so that can be a potential theory of power. You have the link argument pretty well outlined, which says that, the affirmative by saying, oh, AGI is immoral, that assumes that we as agents can kind of prescribe morality to certain notions or certain technologies, which is problematic. And then the impact would be, I'm not sure, maybe something about humanism being bad and allowing for racialized violence across the globe. And then the alternative could be something like, well, I mean, in my opinion, with a link like this, the alternative would have to be something more epistemological, which means that it's based in knowledge production and education. And so you would probably say you should refuse the F in a generative way, or maybe as a one-off rejection. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that answered your question. Like I said, that's just kind of my first wave of thoughts when like you described what you were thinking. But yeah, that seems like a very good idea for like a blueprint for a critique on the next topic. Okay, Gavin, two things first. What was the term exactly that the neck has to prove? Subjectivity formations? Grady, you answered the PF question. You got that. Yeah,
Oh,
it's subjectivity.
yeah. In terms of the PF question, wait, let me read this. I can speciesism case. I guess
Like anthropocentrism.
yeah, it's probably anthropocentrism, which is essentially just like the overfocus on humanity and human life that comes with kind of the over extraction, or like whenever you treat the ocean and the environment as an object, which then leads to things like climate change and also violence towards like land, and then that affects people. I guess that's like probably what I'm thinking of whenever you say things like fishing. It's basically just that prioritizing like humanity and things like capital accumulation over the environment is bad. But it can get more complex with that depending on which author you're reading. Like, does that answer your question? Okay, cool.
Yeah, anthropoids are really cool. It's like a critique of the notion that the human is the center of the earth and that humans are the only beings with agency, with intrinsic value. Because, for example, like even the way that like debaters phrase biodiversity or climate change impacts, it's always like, oh, in the end of all this, it's going to lead to human extinction. But nobody actually cares about the biodiversity loss in itself or literal wildfires, burning down trees, burning down the earth, etc. These are things that people have very little regard for because they don't see a direct connection to human life. What are y'all's favorite critiques? Grady, what's yours?
I like the affirmative framework and extinction outweighs approach. I think that's my favorite. No, on a real note, like cybernetics and psychoanalysis, probably.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Get over here. Do you know Hawken Jam from NE, Ohio?
I know other.
No, I'm sorry. But to be fair, I don't really know like most people in LD because I've like switched around between LD and policy pretty recently, and so I don't know a lot of the newer people. And also I'm just like really terrible at remembering connections. Mr. Paladin. Oh, is that a PF team? Okay.
Oh, that
Yeah,
was
I'm pretty sure.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I wouldn't know. I have not done public forum since like eighth grade, seventh grade. Um, my favorite critique, Caden, is probably just like anti-blackness or like maybe like queer pests. What are ontological based arguments? Caden, I think you know the answer to this question, but I'll answer anyway. Ontological based questions, or arguments. Well, ontology is just the study of being, and so it says that like innately something is core to one's being. In simpler terms, it just means like it is set in stone, it is static to your identity. And so like anti-blackness cases tend to use like ontological claims, for example, and it says that humans have a drive to reinforce the ontological nature of Black individuals as those who experience like social death, for example, according to like authors like Warren. Yeah. Does that make sense? TLDR, it's an argument about permanence. It's typically saying that like progress is not possible for certain groups of people.
And then I think like I don't know if our emails are listed in like the Discord, but we can put them in chat too. So if anyone does have questions like later on, you can for sure email us and we will do our best to respond.
Related KR on the current topic now on the app. Can we join the ICC so we can destroy on the inside with fiat? That's
The thing is that you can't fiat that you would kind of destroy or change the ICC. You could fiat, like, fiat is basically just an argument that we have to imagine ourselves joining the ICC and that not being obstructed in order to get proper education, i.e., a team cannot just say that, oh, like, the affirmative doesn't matter because Trump is in office right now, so he's going to stop us from joining the ICC. No, because we have durable fiat, which means that we imagine that we join the ICC no matter what. However, you don't have control over what happens whenever the US is in the ICC. So if you have cards that say a consequence of the US joining the ICC would be that it kind of destroys or, I don't know, loses all funding and collapses, you could say that. However, you can't necessarily fiat that that happens.
what you could say is like you collapse the USFG, like you destroy the United States, because like if we joined the ICC, it would cause United States officials to be persecuted, like Trump could be persecuted, and then be held liable for war crimes. Um, I'm not like, in my opinion, the solvency of it, like the actual evidence in the literature on that question is like not super great, but like it is a concept. That is called a soft left AF, which is where the AFs still use fiat and they are still topical. But they kind of again focus on issues like structural violence or social justice issues, marginalization of certain groups, and they attempt to forward a solution within the United States and still within the topic. They try to find ways for why like the US joining the ICC or UNCLOS would kind of help with issues that critiques typically present. Okay, wait, let me put my email in the chat.
Okay, yeah, I'll put one.
Yeah, feel free to email me if y'all have questions. Oh, you direct messaged me, Grady.
Oh, wait, thanks.
You kept doing that throughout the call. You kept DMing me in the
I did
Zoom
not.
instead of answering the general chat.
Wait, I did
But
that one time, bro.
okay.
Cool. Does anyone else have questions?
Thank you guys for staying here the whole time. A lot of people left, but
This is the US would demand exemptions. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to like the quality of the evidence necessarily, but
I've not seen a single card that says something like that. And I've done quite a bit of research on this topic, but it's a concept. You're on the right track. This is what a soft left half would Oh wait, you have a card. Okay, so you already have a card that says that. Never mind then. Maybe you're better at research than me. What's a card that says the US would demand exemptions?
The thing is like, I mean, no, it's definitely an idea. I guess like it just functions as a regular kind of like policy aff, and that you would prove that the ICC is bad. But if you approach it from a soft left angle, i.e., you read evidence that the ICC is racist or bad, and then you read that card, you could. I think like you just have to be wary of people who will just take their affirmative prep and read that the ICC like will not or fail and will actually succeed. So you would have to prep out all of those cards. But aside from that, it's definitely a concept that has a root, especially if you have a link that says the US joining would cause other nations to leave.
Gavin, like that's one of the things I love about K-Debate is like even for small schools that don't have a lot of coaches, it's a lot easier for you to get ahead reading critiques as opposed to reading policy arguments because if you read disads, counterplans, apply and text on the AF, then you have to do a lot of cutting updates, which can be very, very exhausting. Okay, Kaden. Okay,
Guys,
Kaden.
Aiden got a bid around at Stanford, actually.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. But a critique is more like if you know your literature base, like if you're willing to put in the work to read and to do practice speeches, obviously, then you can very much get ahead and you can be better than a lot of, policy teams, even if you don't have the same amount of resources. Yeah, that's the great thing about K-Debate, in my opinion, because I used to go to a pretty small school in Texas too. Now I go to Capel, which I'm very privileged to have a good set of resources and coaches and teammates now, but before that wasn't always the case. But even then, I was really appreciative of like critiques because I could still win debate, even if I didn't have much help. Yeah, of course. If y'all have any other specific questions about the lecture, then feel free to drop a question in the Discord server or email one of us. I'm sure Grady would be happy to answer questions in his free time, and the same goes for me. I'm actually gonna stop the recording now. Wait.